2 decades ago, scientists completed a study on a novel corticosteroid that might not have the harsh effects of prednisone, which was, and still is, a main medicine given to children with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. Prednisone had been shown to increase muscle strength. Deflazacort was another intriguing corticosteroid, and we will hear today the story that unfolded. It is a story that every scientist and clinician fears when testing an experimental drug. The company that was developing the drug backed out right after the study was completed, not because it didn't do what scientists had hoped, but it was a gamble, continuing to move it forward. At the time, it was hoped that gene therapy based on the gene for Duchenne that had been discovered would save these children and stop this disease. There is still no federally approved medication for Duchenne. Today, our guest on the Neurology Today podcast is Robert Griggs, professor of neurology, medicine, pediatrics, pathology, and laboratory medicine in the Center for Human Experimental Therapeutics at the University of Rochester School of Medicine. And that study that was completed in 1995, well, it was finally written up and published this month in Neurology. Hi, Dr. Griggs.
Good morning.
Okay, let's start in the beginning with you find this drug deflazacort. Can you tell us how that unfolded?
This was a drug that was studied by our group of Duchenne clinical trialists. This is a group that had been going actually for a number of years before we tackled the deflazacort project, and it was a steroid that was developed and used in Europe and actually was being prescribed for other indications in both adults and kids, and it looked like it might have fewer of the unpleasant side effects that corticosteroids have. And so our group set out to study this and set up a big multi-center study with a drug company. They actually, I think, came to us because they were interested in developing this. This is Nordic Merrill Dow. And the study was full-scale, very carefully done clinical trial in boys with 196 boys with Duchenne dystrophy. And it started in the early 90s and was completed in 1995. For reasons that we're not quite sure about, but as you mentioned in your introduction, often happens, pharmaceutical companies change their mind about what their priorities are. And although the study was done, they said we're not interested in pursuing it. And furthermore, they weren't interested in publishing it. So we said at the time, this is not right. And so we were able to get all the clinical data together and publish an abstract back then that reported the fact that deflazacort seemed to be at least as good as prednisone in terms of strength and might have fewer side effects, so that there seemed to be less weight gain, maybe less unpleasant behavioral effects with the deflazacort. But the problem was when we went to publish this, the company was out of the market. We could not get the laboratory data. We tried for a decade to get the laboratory data, but eventually I kept trying to get other drug companies interested in picking up the option on this because we knew that it would be important to make this drug available in the United States. It's never been available here. It's not FDA approved. It's not on the market for anything. And so we tried getting people, but finally Marathon Pharmaceuticals identified us as a group that had been involved with this and came to me about helping get this data. And so we got them all the data that we had, and then they managed cleverly to find the laboratory data that we needed to be able to publish this paper that was just been published in late August of this year. They also took this data to the FDA, and the prospects are actually reasonably good for this being approved by the FDA, possibly as early as about 6 months from now.
Okay, the big question is, why hasn't prednisone then been approved for Duchenne?
Well, that's a really good question, and that probably relates to the fact that although our group was the first one and to establish in a big clinical trial with placebo that it was highly effective in improving strength, no one picked this up, obtained a use patent to develop it and market it. I think that it is available off-label, but because it's an off-label indication and because it's never been FDA approved, there's always been some question in people's mind as to whether this is really something that should be used, because pediatricians often are reluctant to give corticosteroids because of the side effect. Now, all of us who treat Duchenne think that's a big mistake not to give it, because it clearly lengthens life, prolongs ambulation, improves lung function, improves heart function. All the things have been shown, but there is the issue of side effects, and that's one of the potential benefits of deflazacort. It may cause less weight gain, and so that to find out which drug is better is a major issue, and that we actually set out over a decade ago to compare deflazacort with prednisone, and we have currently a study that has already recruited almost 200 boys looking at the long-term effects of deflazacort versus prednisone, because we, in that short study that we're talking about today, just published in Neurology, it looked like initially there's less weight gain, but we don't know which is best on the long term, and that's one of the things we're trying to find out with our new study. It's a 40-center study in 5 countries, and we're following patients for up to 5 years on the prednisone versus deflazacort.
Could you take us through the actual study that was published in Neurology very quickly in terms of the side effect profile? Because there were some side effects that were a little more prominent in deflazacort and not in prednisone.
That is true. The thing that's impressive in this study, the thing that's important to note about it, it was a relatively short 3-month study comparing prednisone and deflazacort in 2 different doses, a high and a low dose, and placebo, and it's the placebo-controlled data versus deflazacort that is the data that's likely to have this drug FDA approved, because it's a double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trial. Then after 3 months, all the patients on placebo were placed on one of the 3 regimens, either prednisone or the low or the high dose of deflazacort, and everybody was followed for a year. This meant then that we had a comparison for a year-long study between prednisone and deflazacort. And what's interesting, to address your point of side effects, is that both drugs cause weight gain, but deflazacort seemed to cause less weight gain. Both drugs had some behavioral effects in terms of being hyperactivity, and it looked like, although the data weren't significant, it looked like there was more behavioral abnormalities with prednisone than with deflazacort. On the other hand, as you just pointed out in your question, deflazacort seems to cause more cataracts, and we know from other data that's been published just recently that if you look at sort of long-term data with uncontrolled, in terms of placebo-controlled, but there is long-term data suggesting deflazacort may have more problems with bone toxicity, fractures and thinning of the bones, and actually it looks like there may be less growth with deflazacort, and so boys end up being shorter on both medicines, but that effect is worse with deflazacort. It's possible that's one of the reasons deflazacort is of benefit, but what be that as it may, making patients shorter is not necessarily a desirable thing from the point of view of the patient and family, so that deflazacort appears to may have more bone toxicity. That's why the NIH-funded study we're currently doing, comparing the long-term effects of both, is so important.
That's really interesting. And how about parents? Where have they been getting this drug from if it's not available in the U.S.?
Well, it's interesting. It's it's possible for patients to get a prescription, send it to a pharmacy in Mexico or Canada or Europe, and import the drug themselves for a single use. This is what people have done. Not all that many. Most have just taken prednisone when it's been recommended, and so this then, if this is FDA approved, it will become available in this country. Now, one of the things that's also interesting is in Europe, people where deflazacort is available, lots of patients are still taking prednisone. There really is no answer yet as to which is better over the long term.
And what about gene therapy? Is that on the horizon still?
another important question. Gene therapy, in terms of exon skipping or use of antisense oligos, is something that is before the FDA now, and there have been 3 companies that have taken things to the FDA. So far, none of them have been improved, but one treatment, the company Sarepta is relatively optimistic that the FDA will approve their study. But the important point here is that the treatment with these current genetic therapies all are requiring the co-administration of corticosteroids, and so we don't know yet which corticosteroid, and so it's even more important in this new era of gene therapy to know which corticosteroid the patient should be taking, and that's again why we're doing this big 200-patient study to tell which is better over the longer term, because we think that treatments should be started as early as possible, and so a lifetime of treatment requires evidence as to what the long-term risks versus benefits are of prednisone versus deflazacort.
That's terrific. Now, Dr. Griggs, a lot of people have credited you for continuing the fight to find a drug company to get this study published and help patients with DMD answer these questions about the drugs that they will be taking for the rest of their lives. So we thank you for being with us on Neurology Today. We've been speaking with Robert Griggs of the University of Rochester School of Medicine, an expert in Duchenne Muscular Dystrophy. You'll come back again and tell us what the long-term studies do find.
Thank you.